Victoria, later known as Empress Frederick of Germany and Queen of Prussia, was born on a chilly November evening in 1840, the first child of Britain's young Queen Victoria and her beloved Prince Albert. She would grow to become one of the most fascinating and tragic figures of the 19th century, a brilliant princess raised with dreams of liberal reform, married into the rigid Prussian court, mother to the last German Kaiser, and a woman whose political hopes would be dashed by the very son she had brought into the world. Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the extraordinary life of Victoria, Princess Royal, eldest daughter of Queen Victoria, Crown Princess of Prussia, and briefly Empress of Germany. And born into privilege and educated for greatness, she would spend her life caught between two worlds, the liberal, progressive England of her parents and the conservative, militaristic Prussia of her marriage. We'll softly explore her remarkable journey, from her precocious childhood at Windsor and Buckingham Palace, through her romantic yet politically charged marriage to Prince Friedrich of Prussia, to her struggles against the powerful Chancellor Bismarck, and finally to her tragic isolation under her own son, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Along the way, we'll witness the birth of the German Empire, the death of her beloved husband after just 99 days as emperor, and her own painful final years battling illness while watching Europe march toward the conflicts her son would help create. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which aspect of Victoria's life you found most moving, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from Victorian Europe lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. On the 21st of November in 1840, as fog settled over London and the first frost touched the windows of Buckingham Palace, a baby's cry rang through the royal chambers. Queen Victoria, just 21 years old herself, and married for less than a year, had given birth to her first child. The baby was a girl, a disappointment to some who hoped for a male heir, but a source of joy to the young queen and her devoted husband, Prince Albert. "Oh, madame, it's a girl," the doctor announced. Queen Victoria, exhausted from her labor, replied with characteristic pragmatism, "Never mind, next time it will be a prince." The infant princess was healthy and strong, with her mother's bright eyes and what would soon prove to be her father's keen intelligence. She was christened on the 10th of February, 1841, in the throne room of Buckingham Palace, a date chosen deliberately, as it marked the first wedding anniversary of her parents. The baby received the names Victoria Adelaide Mary Louisa, though she would be called simply Vicky by her adoring family. The christening was a grand affair, with the widowed Queen Adelaide, widow of King William IV, standing as one of the godmothers. Other godparents included King Leopold of Belgium, the Duke of Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha, and various other distinguished relatives. The baby wore an elaborate christening gown of white satin and lace, and holy water from the River Jordan was used in the ceremony, following royal tradition. Shortly before her first birthday, little Vicky was granted a special honor. She was created Princess Royal, the fourth princess in British history to hold this honorary title, which is traditionally given to the eldest daughter of the reigning monarch. As Princess Royal, Victoria held a unique position in the royal hierarchy, and for a brief time, until her younger brother Albert Edward was born in November 1841, she was even heir presumptive to the British throne. But being Princess Royal meant more than titles and ceremony. From her earliest days, Victoria's life would be shaped by the ambitions and expectations of her remarkable parents, particularly her father, Prince Albert, who saw in his bright eldest daughter the potential to change the course of European history. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was a man ahead of his time, progressive in his politics, passionate about education, devoted to the arts and sciences, and deeply committed to using the power of the monarchy to improve society. When his first child was born, he was determined that she would receive an education unlike any princess before her. Within weeks of Victoria's birth, Prince Albert sat down to write a detailed memoir outlining the tasks and duties of everyone involved with the royal children. He wanted his daughter raised with discipline, intelligence and purpose. 18 months later, Baron Stockmar, an intimate friend and advisor to the royal couple, produced another document, a full 48 pages detailing the educational principles to be used with the little princess. The royal couple, however, had some unusual ideas about child-rearing. Queen Victoria worried constantly about proper behavior and manners. She once expressed concern that baby Victoria's habit of sucking on bracelets was a sign of deficient education. The Queen herself later admitted that she found babies rather trying and was not particularly comfortable around young children, an irony, given that she would have 9 of them. To guide little Vicky through these early years, the royal couple chose their governesses carefully. The first was Lady Sarah Spencer-Lyttelton, and a widow who had been appointed lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria shortly after the Queen's accession. Lady Lyttelton was a warm, experienced woman who brought common sense and kindness to her role. She diplomatically managed to soften the sometimes unrealistic demands of the royal couple, and the children adored her, calling her Laddle, even when they reached adulthood. As Vicky grew from infant to toddler, her extraordinary intelligence became apparent. She was a precocious child who seemed to absorb knowledge like a sponge. At just 18 months old, she began learning French with a French tutor. By the age of 3, she was studying German. Unlike many children who might resist such intensive education, little Vicky loved learning. She was curious about everything, asked endless questions, and had a remarkable memory. By the age of 6, Victoria was studying arithmetic, geography, and history. Her father personally taught her politics and philosophy, treating her almost as a small adult in their discussions. She also studied Greek and Latin, unusual subjects for a girl at that time, as well as science and literature. Her school days were long, running from 8:20 in the morning until 6 in the evening, with only 3 hours set aside for play and physical activity. The royal family divided their time between several residences: Buckingham Palace in London, Windsor Castle, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and later Balmoral Castle in Scotland. At Osborne, Prince Albert had a Swiss-style cottage built where the royal children could learn practical skills. There, Vicky learned cooking and carpentry, alongside her lessons in languages and history, and Prince Albert wanted his children to understand that privilege came with responsibility, and that they should know how ordinary people lived and worked. Unlike her younger brother Albert Edward, known as Bertie, who would eventually become King Edward VII, Vicky genuinely enjoyed her studies. Where Bertie chafed under the strict educational regime and often disappointed his parents with what they saw as laziness, Vicky excelled and seemed almost to thrive under the pressure. She was determined, focused, and eager to please her beloved father. The relationship between Victoria and Prince Albert was extraordinarily close. She was his favourite child, and he hers. They would take long walks together at Windsor or Balmoral, discussing history, politics, and philosophy. Prince Albert shared with his daughter his vision of constitutional monarchy, based on the British model. A vision in which monarchs ruled not as absolute autocrats, but as constitutional figureheads who worked with elected parliaments for the good of their people. Prince Albert also instilled in Vicky his progressive views on many subjects. He supported Jewish emancipation, opposed slavery, championed education reform, and believed in using science and technology to improve people's lives. These liberal values would shape Victoria's entire worldview and would eventually cause her tremendous difficulties when she married into the deeply conservative Prussian royal family. By the time she was 10 years old, Victoria was fluent in English, French, and German. She could discuss politics with remarkable sophistication, play the piano beautifully, draw and paint with skill, and demonstrate knowledge across a wide range of subjects. She was, in many ways, the ideal product of Prince Albert's educational philosophy: intelligent, cultured, politically aware, and socially conscious. But this intensive education came with a price. Victoria was often isolated from other children her age. She had few friends outside her siblings, and much of her childhood was spent either in lessons or in the formal atmosphere of the royal court. She learned early to control her emotions, to think carefully before speaking, and to carry herself with the dignity expected of a princess. These qualities would serve her well in her future role, but they also meant that her childhood was far from carefree. In the family circle, however, Vicky was lively and affectionate. Her mother described her as having a dear, pretty little face, and noted that she was very intelligent and advanced for her age. Her siblings looked up to her, and she often helped care for the younger children. Despite the formal education and strict routine, there was warmth and love in the royal household, particularly from Prince Albert, who adored all his children, but had a special bond with his brilliant eldest daughter. This close, loving relationship with her father would remain the most important connection of Victoria's early life. Prince Albert saw in Vicky not just a daughter, but a potential force for good in European politics. He dreamed that one day she might help unite Britain and Prussia through a liberal constitutional alliance. It was a dream that would shape the course of Vicky's entire life, and ultimately prove heartbreakingly difficult to achieve. The year 1851 brought excitement to Britain and to the royal family. Prince Albert, always forward-thinking and devoted to progress, had conceived an ambitious project, an international exhibition that would showcase the industrial, technological, and artistic achievements of nations from around the world. It would be called the Great Exhibition, and it would be housed in a magnificent structure of glass and iron in Hyde Park, London, a building that would come to be known as the Crystal Palace. The Great Exhibition was Prince Albert's greatest triumph. Despite opposition from conservatives who feared that foreign revolutionaries would use the event to cause trouble in England, Prince Albert persisted. The Queen Victoria opened the exhibition on the 1st of May, 1851, and it proved to be a colossal success. Over 6 million people visited during its 5-month run, marveling at steam engines, telegraphs, scientific instruments, fine arts and treasures from across the British Empire and beyond. Among the distinguished foreign visitors were Prince Wilhelm of Prussia and his wife, Princess Augusta of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. Prince Wilhelm was the younger brother of King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia, and was himself expected to eventually inherit the Prussian throne. With them came their son, Prince Friedrich Wilhelm, known as Fritz, a handsome young man of 19, who was second in line to the Prussian throne. And Queen Victoria and Prince Albert invited the Prussian royals to stay at Windsor Castle and to visit them at their beloved Isle of Wight retreat, Osborne House. It was there, in the informal atmosphere of Osborne, that 10-year-old Princess Victoria first met Prince Fritz. Fritz was everything a young prince should be: tall, handsome, with fair hair and blue eyes, athletic, and surprisingly liberal in his political views for a Prussian prince. He'd been educated by progressive tutors and perhaps influenced by his mother, Princess Augusta, who held relatively liberal opinions, he was drawn to the constitutional ideas that were so different from the militaristic absolutism that dominated much of the Prussian court. Little Vicky was assigned to show the young prince around the great exhibition. Despite the 9-year age difference, she was a precocious child of 10. He was a young man of 19. They got along remarkably well. Vicky spoke perfect German, impressing Fritz with her intelligence and poise, while Fritz spoke only a few words of English. Fritz later recalled how impressed he had been by her brightness and the mature way she explained the various exhibits to him. For Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, watching the two together, an idea began to form. Prince Albert had long dreamed of a political alliance between Britain and Prussia. He envisioned a unified Germany led by Prussia, but transformed into a constitutional monarchy along British lines, rather than an absolute autocracy. What better way to cement such an alliance than through marriage? If Vicky married Fritz, she could bring British liberal values to the Prussian court and potentially influence the future direction of Germany. After the Prussian royal family returned home, a correspondence began between young Vicky and Fritz. The letters were carefully supervised, as was appropriate for a young girl and an older prince, but they revealed genuine affection and intellectual compatibility. Both Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were pleased with the connection, though they were careful not to push things too quickly. The Prussian court, however, had mixed feelings about the potential match. Many in Berlin were deeply Anglophobic and Russophilic. They disliked England and preferred Russia as an ally. They viewed the British as too liberal, too democratic, and too influenced by commerce rather than military glory. Some courtiers and politicians thought Fritz should marry a Russian or German princess instead. Even King Friedrich Wilhelm IV had to keep his approval of the British match secret, as his wife was strongly anti-English. But Princess Augusta, Fritz's mother, favoured the match. She too held relatively liberal views and admired much about British constitutional government. She also recognised that Vicky was an extraordinary girl, intelligent, well-educated, and likely to make an excellent consort for her son. Over the next 4 years, the connection between Vicky and Fritz was carefully nurtured. They continued to correspond, and the possibility of eventual marriage was understood, though never officially announced. Vicky continued her intensive education, knowing that she might one day become Crown Princess of Prussia, and Prince Albert spoke to her about German politics, about the challenges facing Prussia, and about the potential for creating a more liberal, unified Germany. He was preparing his daughter for what he hoped would be her great life's work. In September 1855, Fritz was invited back to Britain for a visit that everyone understood would be decisive. The destination was Balmoral Castle in Scotland, the royal family's beloved Highland retreat that Prince Albert had purchased just 3 years earlier and was in the process of rebuilding. Balmoral was a special place for the royal family. Away from the formality of London and Windsor, they could relax and enjoy the rugged beauty of the Scottish Highlands. Queen Victoria loved everything about Scotland: the mountains, the clear air, the tartan, the Highland games, even the bagpipes. It was here, and in this romantic setting, that Fritz and Vicky would decide their future. Vicky was now 14 years old, still very young by modern standards, but considered nearly of marriageable age in the mid-19th century. She had grown into an intelligent, accomplished young woman, though she was not conventionally beautiful by the standards of her time. She was relatively short, and her features were pleasant rather than striking. Queen Victoria worried that Fritz might not find her daughter physically attractive enough, as ideals of beauty favoured taller women with different features. But when Fritz arrived at Balmoral, any concerns about physical attraction quickly proved groundless. He and Vicky spent long hours walking in the Highland Hills, talking about everything from politics to philosophy to their hopes for the future. Fritz, and now 24, was deeply impressed by Vicky's intelligence and maturity. She, in turn, found him handsome, kind, and refreshingly liberal in his views compared to most Prussian princes. On the 20th of September, 1855, Fritz proposed to Vicky on a walk near Balmoral. She accepted immediately. Both were genuinely in love. This was not just a dynastic arrangement, but a true romance between two young people who shared values, interests, and genuine affection. When they returned to the castle to share the news, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were delighted. Prince Albert in particular was emotional, seeing in this engagement the fulfillment of his dreams for a liberal alliance between Britain and Prussia. But there was also sadness, as they realized that Vicky, still so young, would soon leave them to live in a foreign country. Because Vicky was only 14, her parents decreed that the wedding would have to wait until she turned 17. The engagement was kept private for the time being, though close family members were told. Vicky returned to her studies with renewed purpose, now certain of her future, and eager to prepare herself for the role of Prussian crown princess. The official announcement of the engagement came in May 1857, and it created quite a stir in both Britain and Prussia. In Britain, many were sad to lose their Princess Royal to a foreign power, though most approved of the match as politically advantageous. In Prussia, reactions were more mixed. Liberals and progressives were pleased, seeing the match as potentially bringing reform to Prussia. Conservatives and militarists were suspicious and worrying about English influence in Prussian affairs. As the wedding date approached, one major controversy arose. Where should the ceremony take place? In Prussia, it seemed natural that the wedding of the heir to the Prussian throne should be held in Berlin. But Queen Victoria firmly insisted that her daughter would marry in England, the assumption of it being too much for a Prince Royal of Prussia. To come over to marry the Princess Royal of Great Britain in England is too absurd, she declared. Whatever may be the usual practice of Prussian princes, it is not every day that one marries the eldest daughter of the Queen of England. Queen Victoria got her way, and the wedding was scheduled for Monday, the 25th of January, 1858, at the Chapel Royal of St. and James's Palace in London, the same place where Victoria and Albert themselves had been married 18 years earlier. The months leading up to the wedding were bittersweet for the royal family. Queen Victoria ordered magnificent preparations, a beautiful wedding dress of white moiré antique trimmed with Honiton lace, with designs of roses, shamrocks, and thistles representing England, Ireland, and Scotland. Vicky would wear a wreath of orange flowers and myrtle, and a veil of Honiton lace. 8 young ladies would serve as bridesmaids, dressed in white tulle with wreaths of pink roses and white heather. But as the day approached, the reality of separation became painfully clear. Vicky would be leaving her beloved family to live in Prussia, hundreds of miles away. She would be leaving her adored father, with whom she had spent so many hours in study and conversation. She would be entering a foreign court where English ways were often viewed with suspicion, where she would have to navigate complex politics and protocol, and where she would be expected to produce an heir for the Prussian throne. Prince Albert gave his daughter advice about her future role. He impressed upon her the importance of being a good influence, of bringing liberal ideas to Prussia, of working for constitutional reform and the eventual unification of Germany under Prussia's leadership. It was a heavy burden for a 17-year-old girl, but Vicky accepted it willingly. She loved her father deeply and wanted to fulfill his hopes for her. The night before the wedding, the family gathered for a quiet dinner. There were tears and embraces, and Queen Victoria wrote in her journal that she felt almost as if it were I that was being married over again, only much more nervous. She worried about her daughter leaving, about the responsibilities Vicky would face, about the difficulties that surely lay ahead. but there was also joy and hope. Fritz was a good man who genuinely loved Vicky, and she loved him. Their marriage was based on affection and shared values, not just political convenience. If anyone could bridge the gap between British and Prussian culture, surely it would be this bright, determined young woman who had been so carefully prepared for just such a role. The morning of January 25th, 1858, dawned cold and foggy in London, with a sharp frost covering the ground. Despite the weather, thousands of people had been gathering since very early in the morning, aligning the streets from Buckingham Palace to St. James's Palace, eager to catch a glimpse of the Princess Royal on her wedding day. Inside Buckingham Palace, Princess Victoria was being dressed in her magnificent wedding gown. The dress was created of rich white moire antique fabric, ornamented with 3 flounces of Honiton lace. The lace featured intricate designs of roses, shamrocks, and thistles worked in open-work medallions, symbols of the 3 kingdoms of England, Ireland, and Scotland. Orange flowers and myrtle blossoms decorated the bodice and train, the myrtle being the traditional bridal flower of Germany. The train was particularly impressive, made of the same white moire antique and lined with satin, bordered with white satin ribbons, Honiton lace, orange flowers, and myrtle. Our 8 bridesmaids would carry this magnificent train as the princess walked down the aisle. Vicky wore a wreath of orange flowers and myrtle on her head, securing the beautiful Honiton lace veil. Her jewelry was elegant, but not overwhelming. A diamond necklace, diamond earrings, and a diamond brooch. On her left sleeve, she wore the Order of Louise, a Prussian order of chivalry, and the Royal Order of Victoria and Albert. At 11 o'clock, the royal procession began. 18 carriages and 300 soldiers formed the procession for the short journey from Buckingham Palace to St. James's Palace. The crowds were enormous, cheering and waving as each carriage passed. Prince Albert, King Leopold of Belgium, and the bride's 2 younger brothers went first. Then came the 3 younger princesses, Alice, Helena, Anne and Louise, dressed in pink satin trimmed with Honiton lace, with wreaths of cornflowers and daisies in their hair. The 4 young princes wore Highland dress in honour of the family's beloved Balmoral. Finally came the last carriage, carrying Queen Victoria and Princess Victoria. The Queen wore black velvet. She was still in mourning for her mother, who had died the previous year, but she wore her most magnificent jewellery. Vicky sat opposite her mother, trying to remain calm despite her nervousness and the overwhelming emotions of the day. The sight of mother and daughter together moved many in the crowd. Queen Victoria's journal reveals her own emotional state. The flourish of trumpets and cheering of thousands made my heart sink within me, and I could hardly command myself. At St. James's Palace, they entered a specially prepared retiring room where Prince Albert, King Leopold, and the 8 bridesmaids were waiting. The bridesmaids looked lovely in their white tulle dresses with wreaths and bouquets of pink roses and white heather. After a few moments to collect themselves, the party moved to the closet, where other members of the family were waiting, including the Duchess of Kent, Queen Victoria's mother, looking elegant in violet velvet trimmed with ermine. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The doors of the Chapel Royal opened and the bridal procession entered. The Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace is a beautiful but relatively small space, and on this day it was filled to capacity with royal guests from across Europe, British nobility, government ministers, and other distinguished guests. The altar was decorated with flowers, and sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the scene despite the foggy morning outside. Fritz stood at the altar in his military uniform, handsome and clearly nervous. As Vicky approached on her father's arm, Fritz's expression softened with love and relief. She looked calm and composed. her training in royal deportment serving her well even in this emotional moment. The ceremony was conducted by John Bird Sumner, the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was a traditional Church of England service, with the addition of some special music chosen by Prince Albert. As Vicky and Fritz knelt together, their hands joined. The 8 bridesmaids arranged the train around them like a cloud. Queen Victoria, watching from her place, wrote later that it looked beautiful seeing her kneeling beside Fritz, and their hands joined, her long train borne by the 8 young ladies, who looked like a cloud of young girls hovering round her. The sight reminded Victoria powerfully of her own wedding to Prince Albert in this very same chapel 18 years earlier. How it reminded me of my having similarly, proudly, tenderly, confidently knelt beside my beloved Albert in the very same spot, she wrote in her journal. Both Vicky and Fritz spoke their vows clearly and firmly. When the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, there was a moment of profound silence in the chapel, and then the congregation erupted in celebration. The young couple turned to face their families, and there were tender embraces all around. Vicky went first to her parents, who held her close, and then to Fritz's parents, who welcomed her as their new daughter-in-law. And after the ceremony, everyone moved to sign the register. The various royals and dignitaries added their signatures, creating a remarkable historical document. Then the newlyweds returned to Buckingham Palace together in the same carriage, while Queen Victoria rode with King Leopold and Fritz's parents. The crowds outside were even larger now, cheering wildly for the young couple. Despite the cold and fog, the atmosphere was festive and joyful. When they reached Buckingham Palace, the newlyweds appeared on the famous balcony to wave to the crowds below, one of the early uses of what would become a beloved royal tradition. Inside the palace, a wedding breakfast was held for the immediate family. It was an intimate affair compared to the grand public ceremony. Just the 2 families and a few very close relatives. The young couple sat together opposite Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, partially hidden by a splendid wedding cake. Queen Victoria sat between King Leopold and Fritz's father, trying to maintain her composure despite her emotions. The meal was elegant, but not excessively long, as everyone knew that the newly married couple needed to begin their journey. They would spend their brief honeymoon at Windsor Castle before Vicky would have to say goodbye to England and travel to her new home in Prussia. As the wedding breakfast concluded, Queen Victoria gave her daughter a long embrace, holding her tightly and whispering words of love and advice. Prince Albert also held his beloved daughter close, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He had prepared her for this moment for her entire life, but now that it had arrived, and the reality of separation was almost unbearable. That evening, after Vicky and Fritz had departed for Windsor, Queen Victoria wrote in her journal, "I cannot bear to think of the moment, now so rapidly approaching, of taking leave of my own darling child. Our first object, our dearest child, the flower of our flock, is about to be separated from us, and I grieve to think how much I shall miss her." But the journal entry also contained hope. God bless and protect her. May she be happy and useful in her new position, and be a blessing to her adopted country. She has a warm, loving heart, and God grant that she may be appreciated. It was a prayer that would echo through the decades to come, a hope that Vicky would indeed be happy and useful, appreciated and valued in her adopted country. But the reality would prove far more complicated and painful than anyone could have imagined on that cold January day when a 17-year-old English princess married a Prussian prince and set out to change the course of German history. The journey from England to Prussia was long and difficult in those days before modern transportation. Vicky and Fritz travelled by ship across the Channel, then by train and carriage across the winter landscape of Northern Europe. For Vicky, Every mile took her farther from everything familiar, her parents, her siblings, her homeland. They arrived in Berlin in early February 1858 to a reception that was magnificent, but also somewhat overwhelming. The Prussian court arranged elaborate ceremonies to welcome the new crown princess. There were military parades, formal receptions, and presentations to hundreds of courtiers and officials, and numerous state banquets. Vicky, still just 17 years old, had to navigate all of this with grace and dignity, while simultaneously adjusting to an entirely new country, language and culture. Berlin in 1858 was a city undergoing transformation. Prussia itself was caught between its feudal, militaristic past and an uncertain, modernizing future. The capital reflected this tension. Grand palaces stood alongside new industrial buildings. Ancient traditions coexisted uneasily with calls for reform, and military culture dominated nearly every aspect of life. The Prussian royal family lived primarily at two residences, the Stadtschloss, City Palace, in central Berlin, and the Neues Palais, New Palace, at Potsdam, a short distance away. Both were magnificent but formal structures, vastly different from the more comfortable atmosphere Vicky had known at Windsor or Balmoral. From the beginning, Vicky faced challenges. The Prussian court was deeply conservative, hierarchical, and suspicious of foreign influence. Many courtiers viewed the young English princess as an outsider who threatened traditional Prussian values. Some whispered that she thought herself superior because of her British birth. Others worried that she would try to make Prussia more like England, undermining Prussian military culture and autocratic traditions. Even small matters became sources of conflict. The Prussian court had very specific protocols for everything: how one dressed, how one addressed various ranks of nobility, how one conducted oneself at formal occasions. Vicky sometimes made mistakes simply because British customs were different. But these errors were seized upon by critics as evidence of her unsuitability. Queen Augusta, Fritz's mother, should have been a natural ally. She, too, held relatively liberal views and had supported the marriage. But the relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law quickly became tense. Augusta was critical of Vicky's choices, from significant matters like political opinions to trivial ones like Vicky's preference for a more modern landau carriage rather than the traditional barouche. Any gesture Vicky made seemed to provide an excuse for Augusta's criticism. The conflicts became so severe that Queen Victoria eventually had to intercede, asking her uncle King Wilhelm, who had by then succeeded his brother to the Prussian throne, to intervene on Vicky's behalf. But this intervention only further reinforced the perception that Vicky was too English, too dependent on her British family, insufficiently Prussian. Even Vicky's excellent German became a source of criticism. Though she spoke the language fluently, she spoke it with an English accent, and sometimes used turns of phrase that were more British than German. Critics used this as evidence that she would never truly be Prussian, that she would always remain fundamentally English. Most difficult of all was Vicky's political position. She and Fritz genuinely believed in constitutional monarchy and liberal reform. They thought Prussia could become more prosperous, more just, and ultimately more powerful by adopting some British-style institutions: an elected parliament with real power, freedom of the press, equal rights for minorities including Jews, and a government that responded to its people rather than ruling them through military force. But these views put them at odds with the most powerful forces in Prussian society: the Junker aristocracy, conservative landowning nobles, the military establishment, and the growing conservative political movement. These groups saw liberalism as a threat to Prussian greatness, British influence as dangerous, and any challenge to autocratic rule as potentially revolutionary. Despite all these challenges, Vicky threw herself into her new role with determination. She began a regular correspondence with her parents, writing to her father every week with detailed observations about German politics and society. Prince Albert wrote back with advice and encouragement on keeping his daughter informed about British affairs and international developments. These letters would continue throughout Prince Albert's life, creating a remarkable record of 19th century politics and court life. Queen Victoria also wrote frequently, though her letters were often more personal and sometimes included criticism that Vicky found difficult. Victoria had very specific ideas about how her daughter should behave, what she should wear, how she should manage her household. She expected Vicky to be equally loyal to England and to Prussia, a nearly impossible balance given the tensions between the two countries. Vicky also tried to make positive contributions to Prussian society. She became interested in charitable work, visiting hospitals and supporting organizations that helped the poor. She tried to establish schools for girls and to improve nurses' training, bringing some of the reforms that Florence Nightingale had pioneered in Britain. But even these benevolent efforts sometimes sparked criticism from those who saw them as inappropriate English interference. Through all these difficulties, Fritz was Vicky's greatest support. Their marriage was genuinely loving, based on shared values and mutual respect, as well as affection. Fritz understood the challenges his wife faced, and he did his best to shield her from the worst of the court gossip and political hostility. They spent as much time as possible together, away from the formal atmosphere of the court. But Fritz himself was in a difficult position. As Crown Prince, he was expected to support his father, King Wilhelm I, even when he disagreed with royal policies. He had to be careful about expressing his liberal views too openly, as this could be seen as disloyal or subversive. The couple felt increasingly isolated, too liberal for the conservatives who dominated Prussian politics, but unable to openly work for the reforms they believed in. As Vicky adjusted to her new life, she clung to the hope that things would improve. She believed that when Fritz eventually became king, they would be able to implement the reforms Prussia needed. She thought that given time, the Prussian people and court would come to appreciate her dedication and good intentions. And most importantly, she believed that she could raise the next generation of Prussian royals with more liberal, humane values. This last hope would prove most important of all, for within a year of her arrival in Prussia, Sir Vicky became pregnant with her first child. But the birth of that child would bring not joy but tragedy, a tragedy whose consequences would haunt Vicky for the rest of her life and would ultimately change the course of European history. Just over a year after her marriage, on the 27th of January 1859, Princess Victoria went into labour with her first child. It should have been a moment of joy and celebration, but instead it became a nightmare that would haunt the family for generations. The trouble began even before labour started. The maid responsible for alerting the doctors when Victoria's contractions began failed to give notice promptly. When the physicians finally arrived, they found themselves in a delicate situation. Victorian-era modesty was extreme, even in medical emergencies, and the gynecologist hesitated to properly examine the princess, who was wearing only a flannel nightgown. These delays proved catastrophic. The baby was in breech position, feet or bottom first rather than head first, an extremely dangerous situation in the mid-19th century, before modern obstetric techniques existed. As the labour progressed without proper intervention, both mother and child came perilously close to death. The delayed delivery meant the baby was deprived of oxygen for an extended period, perhaps 8 to 10 minutes according to later estimates. Finally, through desperate efforts, the doctors managed to deliver the child, a boy, the long-awaited heir. Both mother and baby survived, but the traumatic birth had lasting consequences. The baby had suffered damage to the brachial plexus, which had the network of nerves that controls the arm and hand. His left arm failed to develop normally, and as he grew, it became clear that the damage was permanent. By the time he reached adulthood, his left arm would be 15 centimeters, nearly 6 inches shorter than his right arm, withered and largely useless. There has been much speculation over the years about other possible effects of the oxygen deprivation during birth. Some historians and medical experts have wondered whether the future Kaiser Wilhelm II's volatile personality, his mood swings, his tendency toward impulsive decisions, and his difficulty controlling his emotions might have been partially caused by subtle neurological damage sustained during those critical minutes of oxygen deprivation. We can never know for certain, but it remains a haunting possibility. For Victoria, the birth was traumatic not just physically, but emotionally. She had nearly died. Her first child had been permanently injured, and as she recovered, she faced criticism from the Prussian court. Some whispered that English doctors had been involved, though in fact the physicians were German. Others suggested that Victoria's English ways had somehow contributed to the difficult birth. There were even cruel suggestions that the baby's disability was divine punishment for the English princess's liberal views. The baby was named Friedrich Wilhelm Victor Albert, after his father, grandfather, and maternal grandfather. The family called him Wilhelm, or sometimes Willy. Despite his disability, he was the heir to the Prussian throne after his father, and from his earliest days, his life would be shaped by that destiny. Victoria loved her son, and as any mother would, but the relationship was complicated from the beginning. She felt guilty about his injury, even though the difficult birth was not her fault. She also worried about how his disability would affect his future as a ruler. And as Wilhelm grew, she tried various treatments and exercises to improve his arm, some of them painful for the child. These well-intentioned efforts, combined with the high expectations placed on Wilhelm as the heir, created tension between mother and son that would only deepen over time. 14 months after Wilhelm's birth, Victoria gave birth to a daughter, Charlotte, on the 24th of July, 1860. This delivery was mercifully easier, and Charlotte arrived healthy and strong. The christening of Charlotte illustrated some of the tensions in Victoria's position, and Queen Victoria wanted the baby named after her, while the Prussian court wanted her named after a Prussian princess. In the end, she was legally named Victoria, but always called Charlotte, one of her middle names, a compromise that satisfied neither side. More children followed in the years ahead. Prince Heinrich was born on the 14th of August, 1862. Then came a tragedy. Little Prince Sigismund, born on the 15th of September, 1864, died of meningitis on the 18th of June, 1866, when he was just 21 months old. The death of Sigismund was devastating for Victoria. She had already suffered through criticism, political isolation, and the guilt over Wilhelm's injury. Now she lost a child. Queen Victoria, still deep in her own mourning for Prince Albert, who had died in 1861, was not as sympathetic as one might hope. She actually chided her daughter for excessive grief, writing, "It is not right in you, dear child, to say you would give up everything to get little Siggy back." It was a cruel rebuke, motivated by Victoria's strange possessiveness of grief. She seemed to feel that no one else's sorrow could match her own over Albert's death. But the loss of Sigismund did have one positive effect on Victoria's approach to motherhood. She had followed the aristocratic custom with her 3 oldest children, Wilhelm, Charlotte, and Heinrich, leaving them largely in the care of governesses and tutors. But after Sigismund's death, Victoria decided to raise her younger children more personally. She wanted to be more involved in their daily lives, to know them more intimately, to create closer bonds. 4 more children were born in the years that followed. Princess Victoria, born April the 12th, 1866. Prince Waldemar, born February 10th, 1868. Princess Sophie, born June 14th, 1870. And Princess Margaret, born April the 22nd, 1872. These younger children indeed had a closer relationship with their mother than the 3 eldest had experienced. Tragically, Prince Waldemar died of diphtheria on the 27th of March, 1879, when he was just 11 years old. Victoria had now lost 2 of her 8 children, both to diseases that modern medicine can prevent or treat. The grief of these losses never truly left her, and both boys would later be buried alongside their parents in the royal mausoleum. The surviving children would all eventually marry and have lives of their own. Charlotte married Bernhard III, Duke of Saxe-Meiningen, and Anne had 1 child. Heinrich married his first cousin, Princess Irene of Hesse, and by Rhine, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria through another line, and had 3 children. Princess Victoria's romantic life would be complicated and sad. She fell deeply in love with Prince Alexander of Bulgaria, but political obstacles prevented the marriage, leading to eating disorders and depression before she eventually married Prince Adolf of Schaumburg-Lippe in a union that produced no children. Sophie married King Constantine I of Greece and had 6 children, and Margaret married Prince Friedrich Karl of Hesse and had 6 children. But it was Wilhelm, the eldest, who would prove most important and most troubling. As he grew from a baby to a boy to a young man, his relationship with his mother became increasingly strained and difficult. On the 14th of December, 1861, Victoria received news that shattered her world. Her beloved father, Prince Albert, had died at Windsor Castle. He was just 42 years old. The cause of death was typhoid fever, though Prince Albert had been weakened by years of overwork and stress. Victoria was devastated. Prince Albert had been the most important person in her life, the one who had educated her, encouraged her, believed in her potential to change history. He had been her confidant, her advisor, her emotional anchor. Even after her marriage, when she lived hundreds of miles away in Prussia, his letters had sustained her through the difficulties of her new life. Now, suddenly, he was gone. She travelled to England immediately for the funeral, but the journey was long, and she arrived only just in time. The grief of that ceremony, of standing in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, watching her father's coffin being carried to the royal vault, would stay with her forever. Queen Victoria's grief was overwhelming and, many thought, excessive. She withdrew from public life almost entirely, wearing black mourning dress for the rest of her life. She kept Prince Albert's rooms exactly as they had been on the day he died, with fresh clothes laid out daily, as if he might return at any moment. She commissioned statues and monuments to him across Britain. Her mourning became so all-consuming that it affected her ability to carry out royal duties, and she became known as the Widow of Windsor. For Vicky, her mother's intense mourning created additional burdens. Queen Victoria seemed to expect that Vicky's grief should match her own, and she was critical when she felt her daughter was not sufficiently devoted to Prince Albert's memory. At the same time, Queen Victoria made it clear that no one else, not even her beloved daughter, could truly understand the depths of her loss. But Vicky's grief was genuine and profound. She had lost her father, her mentor, her greatest supporter, and the loss came at a particularly difficult time in her life. She was struggling with the challenges of life at the Prussian court, isolated by her English background and liberal views, criticized from all sides, and now she had lost the person who had always encouraged her to persist, to believe in her mission, to think that she could make a difference. Prince Albert's death also had practical consequences for Victoria's political situation. Her father had been her chief advisor on how to navigate Prussian politics, how to advance liberal causes without causing too much offense, how to maintain her position. Without his guidance, she felt more adrift than ever. The timing was particularly unfortunate, because Prussia was entering a period of intense political conflict, and Victoria and Fritz found themselves increasingly at odds with the forces that would dominate Prussian politics for decades to come. In March of 1861, King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia died, and Fritz's father became King Wilhelm I. This meant that Fritz and Victoria were now Crown Prince and Crown Princess, next in line to rule Prussia. It should have been a moment of increased influence and opportunity, but instead it marked the beginning of even greater political isolation. A King Wilhelm I was a military man through and through, devoted to the Prussian army and to autocratic rule. He wanted to expand and modernize the military, but the Prussian Landtag, Parliament, refused to authorize funding for his military reforms. A constitutional crisis developed, with the king and Parliament deadlocked. The crisis came to a head in March 1862, when the king dissolved Parliament rather than compromise. He considered abdicating, unwilling to rule if he couldn't have his way. Victoria actually tried to convince Fritz to accept his father's abdication. She thought that if Fritz became king, they could implement liberal reforms and end the constitutional crisis through compromise. But Fritz refused. He believed that a monarch abdicating due to conflict with Parliament would set a terrible precedent and weaken the monarchy. He also felt it would be a serious failure of his duty as a son to benefit from his father's abdication. Instead, King Wilhelm I made a fateful decision. On the 22nd of September, 1862, he appointed Otto von Bismarck as Minister-President of Prussia. Bismarck was a conservative politician willing to rule without parliamentary approval, willing to govern without an authorized budget if necessary, and devoted to expanding Prussian power through military force, rather than liberal reform. The appointment of Bismarck was a disaster for Victoria and Fritz's hopes of reforming Prussia. Bismarck was everything they opposed: autocratic, militaristic, contemptuous of constitutional limits, and deeply suspicious of liberal ideas and British influence. He would dominate Prussian and later German politics for nearly 3 decades, and he would be instrumental in isolating and undermining the Crown Prince and Crown Princess. From the beginning, Bismarck and Victoria disliked each other intensely. Bismarck saw Victoria as a dangerous English influence trying to undermine Prussian military culture and traditional autocratic government. He thought she was meddling in politics inappropriately for a woman and a foreigner. He resented her intelligence and her political engagement. Victoria, for her part, saw Bismarck as a reactionary obstacle to progress, a man who ruled through force rather than consent, who cared nothing for constitutional principles or human rights, who was leading Prussia down a dangerous path. She made no secret of her opposition to his policies, and Bismarck used this to further isolate her and Fritz from positions of influence. The conflict escalated when Victoria and Fritz made a trip to the Mediterranean in October 1862 aboard Queen Victoria's yacht. Conservative critics used this as a pretext to accuse Fritz of abandoning his father during a time of political crisis. They emphasized that the Crown Prince was traveling on a foreign vessel escorted by an English warship, clear evidence, they claimed, that he was more loyal to England than to Prussia. When the engagement of Victoria's brother, the Prince of Wales, to Princess Alexandra of Denmark was announced, Victoria's position became even more complicated. Alexandra was the daughter of the man who would soon become King Christian IX of Denmark, and Denmark and Prussia were heading toward conflict over the disputed territories of Schleswig and Holstein. Many in Berlin suspected that Victoria was secretly unhappy about Prussian military successes against her sister-in-law's homeland. Despite these suspicions, Victoria actually supported Prussia in its conflicts. When the Second Schleswig War broke out in 1864, she supported German troops, even though this created tensions within the British royal family. Following the example of Florence Nightingale, who had improved medical care for British soldiers during the Crimean War, Victoria became involved in organizing aid for wounded German soldiers. But her efforts were never enough to overcome the fundamental distrust many Prussians felt toward her. She was English, she was liberal, she was a woman who interested herself in politics, and any gesture she made could be interpreted negatively by those determined to see her as an outsider and a threat. The 1860s and early 1870s saw the dramatic transformation of Central Europe through 3 wars that would culminate in the creation of the German Empire, though not the liberal constitutional empire that Victoria and Fritz had hoped for. The first conflict was the Second Schleswig War of 1864, in which Prussia and Austria together fought against Denmark over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. Despite the complicated family connections, Victoria's brother married to a Danish princess. The crown princess supported the Prussian cause. The war ended with Danish defeat and the transfer of the duchies to joint Prussian-Austrian administration. But this joint administration quickly became a source of conflict between Prussia and Austria. Bismarck saw an opportunity to challenge Austrian dominance in German affairs. On the 9th of June, 1866, Prussia took over Holstein, and Austria called on other German states to unite against Prussia. Prussia responded by invading, starting the Austro-Prussian War. Fritz played a key military role in the Battle of Königgrätz on the 3rd of July, 1866, where Austria suffered a decisive defeat. The Peace of Prague on the 23rd of August formalized Austria's withdrawal from German affairs and the addition of several territories to Prussia. Bismarck then created the North German Confederation, a union of Prussia with various German states, the first major step toward German unification, though still excluding the southern German states. Fritz was pleased with this progress toward German unity, even if it was being achieved through military force rather than liberal reform. Victoria shared his mixed feelings. Unity was desirable, but the methods and the autocratic character of the emerging confederation troubled her. Bismarck, ever jealous of Fritz's military successes and always looking for ways to undermine the crown prince and princess, used the late arrival of Fritz's Third Army to Paris during the final stages of the war to spread rumors. He accused Fritz of deliberately delaying in order to protect France, supposedly under pressure from his English mother and English wife. During an official dinner, Bismarck publicly accused Queen Victoria and Crown Princess Victoria of being ardently Francophile, a serious accusation at a time of nationalist fervour, and the incident was quickly reported in newspapers, further damaging Victoria's reputation. The final step in German unification came with the Franco-Prussian War, which began on the 19th of July, 1870. Once again, Fritz participated actively in the fighting, leading the Third German Army in crucial battles at Wissembourg, Wörth, and Sedan, and playing a notable role in the Siege of Paris. France's Second Empire collapsed, and on the 18th of January, 1871, at the Palace of Versailles, the German Empire was proclaimed with King Wilhelm I of Prussia as its hereditary German emperor, Kaiser. Fritz and Victoria were now Crown Prince and Crown Princess, not just of Prussia, but of the new German Empire. Their son Wilhelm was second in line to this powerful new throne. Or Germany had been unified, but it had been unified under Prussian military dominance and Bismarck's autocratic leadership, not through the liberal constitutional means that Victoria and Fritz had hoped for. The new German Empire was essentially an enlarged Prussia. The constitution gave enormous power to the Kaiser and his chancellor, with only limited influence for the elected Reichstag. It was a military state, dominated by Junker aristocrats and army officers, suspicious of democracy and liberal values. For Victoria, who had dreamed of helping create a constitutional Germany modelled on Britain, it was a bitter disappointment. Yet she and Fritz continued to hope that when Wilhelm I died and Fritz inherited the throne, they would be able to reform the empire, to make it more liberal, more constitutional, more humane. They held on to this hope through the 1870s and into the 1880s, even as Bismarck remained firmly in control and their own influence remained limited. As the years passed, the relationship between Victoria and her eldest son Wilhelm deteriorated steadily. What had begun as a complicated mother-son dynamic, affected by the trauma of his birth and his physical disability, evolved into something far more troubled and ultimately politically significant. Wilhelm deeply resented his withered arm. He was intensely self-conscious about it and developed various strategies to hide it, holding gloves in his left hand, positioning himself carefully in photographs, keeping his left hand in his pocket or behind his back. And the disability meant he had to work much harder than other young princes at horseback riding and other physical activities expected of Prussian royalty. To his credit, he became an accomplished rider despite his handicap, but the constant effort and the awareness of his difference took an emotional toll. Wilhelm also resented the treatments his mother had subjected him to as a child. She had tried various therapies to improve his arm, some of them painful, none of them successful. In Wilhelm's mind, these treatments were evidence that his mother was ashamed of him, that she saw him as defective, that she cared more about his disability than about him as a person. The educational approach Victoria and Fritz took with Wilhelm also created problems. They were determined to raise him with liberal values and to teach him about constitutional government, to make him a more enlightened ruler than the traditional Prussian autocrat. But Wilhelm resisted this education. He preferred his German tutors, who taught him about Prussian military glory, autocratic rule, and German nationalism. He came to see his parents' liberalism as weak, unpatriotic, and excessively English. As Wilhelm grew older, he increasingly identified with his grandfather, Kaiser Wilhelm I, rather than with his parents. The old Kaiser represented traditional Prussian military culture, absolute monarchy, and German power. Wilhelm's father Fritz, by contrast, seemed weak to the young prince, dominated by his English wife, supporting liberal ideas that Wilhelm saw as foreign and dangerous. The conflict between Wilhelm and his parents intensified as he reached young manhood. He criticized his mother openly at court. He made no secret of his preference for autocratic rule over constitutional monarchy. He became close to conservative and militaristic elements at court, precisely the people who most opposed Victoria and Fritz's liberal views. In 1881, when Wilhelm was 21, he proposed to Princess Augusta Victoria of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg, Augustenburg, known as Donna. Victoria and Fritz had reservations about the match. They found Donna rather dull and limited, with none of the intellectual engagement they valued. But Wilhelm was determined, and his parents eventually gave their consent. The couple married in February 1881 and would remain together for 40 years until Donna's death in 1921. Donna was everything Wilhelm wanted in a wife, and everything his mother was not. She was conventionally pious, docile, devoted to her husband without question, uninterested in politics, and supportive of traditional conservative values. Wilhelm used his marriage to Donna to create a household that rejected his parents' liberal principles. He made clear that he saw his wife as superior to his mother in every way that mattered to him. The relationship between Wilhelm and Victoria reached a crisis during his father's final illness. Wilhelm would later make a shocking accusation. An English doctor killed my father, and an English doctor crippled my arm, which is the fault of my mother. This bitter statement revealed how Wilhelm had come to blame his mother for both of the great tragedies of his early life, his disability and his father's death. For Victoria, watching her son become increasingly conservative, militaristic, and hostile to everything she and Fritz believed in was heartbreaking. She had hoped to raise a liberal, enlightened future Kaiser who would reform Germany. Instead, she had raised someone who rejected her values and seemed to take pleasure in opposing her. This troubled mother-son relationship was not just a personal tragedy. It had profound political implications because Wilhelm would eventually become Kaiser Wilhelm II, one of the most consequential rulers of the 20th century, whose policies would help lead Europe into the catastrophe of World War I. While Wilhelm caused his parents grief, Victoria's other children brought their own challenges and complications, though also some joys. Her second daughter, Princess Victoria, known as Maretta in the family to distinguish her from her mother, fell deeply in love with Prince Alexander of Battenberg, the ruler of Bulgaria, whom everyone called Sandro. Victoria met him in 1881 when she was 15, and by the time he visited again the following year, she was completely smitten. The match had some advantages. Sandro was a reigning prince, though of a small and unstable country. Victoria and Fritz were sympathetic to the match, seeing in Sandro a courageous and relatively liberal ruler. Queen Victoria also approved of him, but there were serious obstacles. Although Sandro was technically a sovereign prince, he was born of a morganatic marriage, which placed him in an inferior position according to the proud Hohenzollern family's standards. More seriously, Russia, a traditional Prussian ally, despised Sandro's policies in Bulgaria. Tsar Alexander III saw Sandro as an enemy. Bismarck feared that a marriage between a German princess and Russia's enemy would damage the League of the Three Emperors, the alliance between Germany, Austria, and Russia that was central to his foreign policy. The Chancellor worked to convince Kaiser Wilhelm I to forbid the match, and he succeeded. This rejection deepened the conflict between Wilhelm I and his son Fritz, and it made Victoria even more bitter toward Bismarck. The situation dragged on for years, with Victoria and Sandro continuing to love each other, but unable to marry. By 1887, Kaiser Wilhelm I was 90 years old and clearly failing, which meant Fritz would soon become Kaiser and could approve the marriage. But tragedy intervened. Fritz was diagnosed with cancer of the larynx, and although he would briefly become Kaiser, he would die before he could arrange his daughter's marriage. Wilhelm II, upon becoming Kaiser in 1888, immediately and definitively forbade the match. Heavily influenced by Bismarck, the new Kaiser had no sympathy for his sister's romantic desires. Sandro, recognizing that the marriage would never happen, returned all of Victoria's letters and gifts, along with a heartbreaking farewell note. Victoria was devastated. At 22, she feared becoming a spinster. Her mood plummeted, and she developed what we would now recognize as an eating disorder, most likely anorexia. Her mother wrote to Queen Victoria in 1889 that her one craze is to be thin. She starved completely. She will ruin her health. Victoria also suffered from depression, though this was not well understood at the time. Eventually, in 1890, Victoria married Prince Adolf of Schaumburg-Lippe, a union that her mother and she herself later acknowledged was born of desperation from fear at withering on the vine. The marriage produced no children and was not particularly happy. After Adolf died in 1916 during World War I, Victoria caused a scandal in 1927 by marrying a Russian student named Alexander Zubkov, who was 35 years younger than she was. She died in 1929 at the age of 63. Victoria's other daughters had somewhat better romantic outcomes. Sophie married King Constantine I of Greece in October 1889. This was a successful match in many ways. Sophie became Queen of the Hellenes and had 6 children, including the future King Paul of Greece and Princess Helen, who would become Queen Mother of Romania. However, Sophie's life was not easy. She lived through wars, political upheavals, and family tragedies. Margaret, the youngest daughter, married Prince Friedrich Karl of Hesse in 1893. He would briefly be elected King of Finland in 1918, though he never actually reigned due to political changes following World War I. Margaret had 6 children and maintained a relatively stable family life. Even Charlotte, Victoria's second child, had a reasonably successful marriage to Bernhard III, Duke of Saxe-Meiningen, though the couple had only one child who survived to adulthood. Through all these marriages and family developments, Victoria tried to be a supportive mother, offering advice and comfort. Even when her own position was becoming increasingly difficult, she maintained correspondence with her daughters throughout their lives, in much as her own mother had done with her. These letters reveal a woman who, despite all her political frustrations and personal sorrows, remained deeply devoted to her children, even to Wilhelm, whose rejection of her values cut her to the heart. The late 1880s brought a series of events that would fundamentally transform Victoria's life and destroy her long-held hopes for liberal reform in Germany. It began with hope and ended in tragedy, a pattern that seemed to define so much of Victoria's experience. Kaiser Wilhelm I was in his 90s by the mid-1880s, and it was clear that Fritz would soon inherit the throne. For decades, Victoria and Fritz had waited for this moment, hoping that when they finally gained power, they could implement the reforms they believed Germany needed. They wanted to make the German Empire more constitutional and to reduce Bismarck's autocratic control, to increase the power of the Reichstag, to protect press freedom and minority rights. But even as Wilhelm I aged, a more immediate crisis was developing. In early 1887, Fritz began experiencing problems with his voice. His throat hurt, and he was increasingly hoarse. Doctors examined him and initially found nothing alarming, but the symptoms persisted and worsened. A British doctor, Sir Morrell Mackenzie, was called in for consultation. After examining Fritz, Mackenzie initially found no clear signs of cancer, though he advised continued monitoring. As months passed, however, Fritz's condition deteriorated. By November, he had lost his voice completely. German doctors were finally able to make a definitive diagnosis: cancer of the larynx, malignant and advanced, and the only potential treatment was to remove Fritz's larynx entirely, a drastic and dangerous surgery. Fritz refused to undergo the operation. Victoria supported his decision, believing that the surgery would be too traumatic and might not save him anyway. This decision led to serious arguments with Wilhelm, who accused his mother of being happy about his father's illness, a cruel and unjust accusation that revealed the depth of Wilhelm's hostility toward his mother. On the 8th of February, 1888, less than a month before Wilhelm I's death, a cannula was fitted to Fritz's throat to allow him to breathe. For the rest of his life, he would be unable to speak and had to communicate by writing notes. Kaiser Wilhelm I died on the 9th of March, 1888, at the age of 90. Fritz, despite being gravely ill, was now Friedrich III and German Emperor and King of Prussia. Victoria was now the German Empress, a position she had anticipated for decades, which she had hoped to use to transform Germany, and which she would hold for only the briefest of moments. The year 1888 is known in German history as the Year of Three Emperors. Wilhelm I, Friedrich III, and Wilhelm II all reigned that year. Friedrich's reign would be tragically short. Despite his terrible illness, Fritz did his best to carry out his duties as emperor. On the day of his accession, he took the ribbon and star of the Order of the Black Eagle from his jacket and pinned it on his wife's dress, a gesture meant to honor Victoria's position as Empress and to show the world that he valued her partnership. He appointed Victoria as Lady of the Order of the Black Eagle, the highest honor in Prussia. But Fritz and Victoria quickly realized that their power was more symbolic than real. Bismarck remained Chancellor and still controlled the government. The military establishment remained firmly in the hands of conservative generals. Wilhelm, as Crown Prince, was already positioning himself to take power and was making clear that he intended to rule very differently from his father. Victoria and Fritz were, as she later wrote, just shadows ready to be replaced by William. Fritz could take only a few symbolic actions during his brief reign. He pardoned some political prisoners. He made some small reforms to administrative procedures. He tried to establish a more conciliatory relationship with the Reichstag, but he lacked the time and the strength to implement any major changes. As Fritz weakened, Wilhelm became more aggressive in asserting his authority. He disagreed with his parents on virtually every matter of policy. He made clear his disdain for their liberal values and his intention to restore autocratic rule when he became Kaiser. He gathered conservative allies around him and prepared to take power. Fritz spent his final weeks at the Neue Palais in Potsdam. Victoria nursed him devotedly, watching helplessly as cancer consumed the man she loved, the partner with whom she had hoped to reform Germany. All their dreams, all their plans, all those decades of waiting, none of it would come to fruition. Their liberal empire would never exist. On the 15th of June, 1888, just 99 days after becoming emperor, Fritz died at the age of 56. Wilhelm immediately became Kaiser Wilhelm II at the age of 29. The new Kaiser's first actions revealed how completely he rejected his parents' values. He ordered the Neue Palais to be surrounded by troops and searched, ostensibly looking for sensitive state papers, but in reality, trying to find his parents' private correspondence. He wanted to seize any letters that might criticize him or his grandfather's regime. But Victoria had anticipated this. She had already arranged for her most important papers to be smuggled out of the palace and sent to England for safekeeping. Wilhelm then demanded that his mother vacate the Neues Palais immediately, as he wanted to use it as his own residence. Victoria, still grieving, still reeling from the loss of her husband and the destruction of all their hopes, had to pack up and leave the home she had inhabited for decades. From that moment on, she was no longer Crown Princess, no longer Empress. She became known simply as Empress Frederick, Kaiserin Friedrich in German, a widow without power, a mother estranged from her emperor son, a political force neutralized. Unable to remain at the Neues Palais and unwilling to live at Sanssouci, another royal palace, Victoria decided to build a new home of her own. She acquired property in Kronberg im Taunus, in the former Duchy of Nassau, not far from Frankfurt. There, she would construct a castle that would be named Friedrichshof in honor of her late husband. Victoria had inherited a substantial fortune after the death of the wealthy Maria de Brignoles-Sales, Duchess of Galliera, which allowed her to finance the construction of her new home. The castle was designed in the English Renaissance style, reflecting Victoria's continued connection to her British heritage. It featured comfortable rooms, beautiful gardens, and spaces to display the art collection she had been assembling for decades. The construction took several years, but by 1894, Friedrichshof was complete. Victoria moved in with her younger daughters Margaret and Sophie. Sophie would marry soon after. Finally, at age 53, Victoria had a home that was truly her own, not a palace controlled by the Prussian court. not a residence assigned by Kaiser Wilhelm II, but a place where she could live according to her own preferences. Victoria loved Friedrichshof passionately. She wrote that it was so charming, so tidy, clean, well kept, and in apple pie order. She filled it with books, art, and mementos of her life with Fritz, as she created a salon where liberal-minded friends could gather to discuss politics, philosophy, and the arts, the kind of intellectual atmosphere she had always valued, but had rarely been able to cultivate in the formal Prussian court. She also formed her own small court at Friedrichshof, maintaining close relations with liberal circles in Germany despite Wilhelm II's clear preference that she leave Germany permanently. Among her guests were physicians like Hermann von Helmholtz and Rudolf Virchow, the philosopher Eduard Zeller, and the historian Hans Delbrück, all distinguished intellectuals who shared Victoria's progressive values. Despite the physical beauty and intellectual stimulation of her new home, Victoria's life at Friedrichshof was marked by increasing isolation, and her younger daughters married and left to establish their own households. Sophie married King Constantine of Greece in October 1889. Victoria married Prince Adolf of Schaumburg-Lippe in 1890. Margaret married Prince Friedrich Karl of Hesse in 1893. With each departure, Victoria felt more alone. Wilhelm II made Victoria's isolation worse by deliberately excluding her from public life. When Empress Augusta, Victoria's mother-in-law, died in 1890, Victoria had hoped to succeed her as patron of the German Red Cross and the Vaterländischer Frauenverein, Association of Patriotic Women. These were prestigious charitable positions that would have given Victoria a public role and a way to contribute to German society. But Wilhelm II gave these positions to his wife, Empress Augusta Victoria. Instead, it was a deliberate slight, and meant to demonstrate that Victoria had no place in the new regime. Victoria did not hesitate to criticize her son's policies and behavior, both in private letters and occasionally in less private settings. When Wilhelm II wrote in the guest book of the city of Munich the words Suprema lex regis voluntas, the will of the king is the supreme law, Victoria was indignant. She wrote to her mother, "The Tsar, an infallible pope, a Bourbon, or our poor Charles I might have pronounced that phrase, but a monarch of the 19th century." She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. She thought her son was behaving like an absolute autocrat, out of step with modern constitutional principles. These criticisms did not endear Victoria to Wilhelm, needless to say. The relationship between mother and son, already strained, became increasingly bitter, and Wilhelm viewed his mother as a meddling English liberal who had never properly understood or appreciated Prussia. Victoria viewed her son as a dangerous autocrat whose aggressive policies were leading Germany toward catastrophe. By the mid-1890s, their relationship had deteriorated so far that they saw each other only rarely. Wilhelm wrote to his mother that, "He is quite nice to me, and I have forgiven him with all my heart the cruel wrong he did me. But of course we meet seldom, and I am a complete outsider." The forgiveness, however, was more aspirational than real. Victoria had not forgotten how Wilhelm had treated her after Fritz's death, how he had sided with Bismarck against his parents, how he had rejected everything she and Fritz had worked for. Still, there were moments of reconciliation. By 1896, Victoria was writing to her mother, Queen Victoria, that Wilhelm is quite nice to me, and I've forgiven him with all my heart. But immediately she added a significant qualification. But of course we meet seldom, and I am a complete outsider. The forgiveness was there, but the relationship remained distant and formal. Victoria kept herself busy at Friedrichshof with her charitable work, her art collection, her extensive correspondence, and her reading. She remained remarkably well informed about European politics and continued to write detailed letters to her mother and to her brother, now King Edward VII, about German affairs. She maintained her intellectual curiosity and her commitment to liberal values even as she watched with dismay as Germany under Wilhelm II moved in directions she found increasingly troubling. She also devoted significant time to painting and to visiting the artist colony at Kronberg. Art had always been one of her passions. Like her mother, Queen Victoria, and her father, Prince Albert, she was a skilled artist herself. The creative work provided some solace during these difficult years, but underneath the calm routine of life at Friedrichshof, there was profound sadness. Victoria had spent her entire adult life working toward a goal, liberal reform of Prussia and Germany, that now seemed more distant than ever. She had sacrificed so much, her homeland, her family, her youth, for a dream that had died with her husband. She was isolated in a country that had never fully accepted her, estranged from her eldest son, who now ruled that country, and watching helplessly as Europe moved toward conflicts that her political insights told her were coming. In letters to family and close friends, Victoria sometimes expressed her deep disappointment. She had been raised to believe she could make a difference, that her marriage would create a bridge between Britain and Germany, that she could help transform Germany into a more liberal constitutional state. Instead, she had spent 40 years being criticized, opposed, and ultimately sidelined. And now, in her 50s, she was largely forgotten, except as the mother of the Kaiser, a Kaiser whose values were opposed to everything she believed in. In 1899, Victoria travelled to Balmoral to visit her mother, Queen Victoria, now 80 years old and increasingly frail. It should have been a pleasant reunion, and a chance to reconnect with family and homeland after the isolation of Friedrichshof. But during this visit, Victoria began feeling unwell, dizzy and weak. British doctors examined her and discovered something terrible: breast cancer, already advanced and inoperable. Victoria was told the truth about her diagnosis, though she chose to inform only a few close family members. She wrote to her mother with characteristic stoicism, "I assure you my thoughts are not incessantly dwelling in a morbid way on my own health." But she understood the gravity of the situation. In the late 19th century, there was no effective treatment for advanced cancer. The diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. Victoria returned to Friedrichshof to face whatever time remained to her. For a while, she continued with her normal routines, in trying to maintain as much normalcy as possible. She worked on her correspondence, received visitors, continued her charitable activities. But the disease was relentless. By the autumn of 1900, the cancer had spread from her breast to her spine. The pain became severe. Victoria began experiencing spasms every few hours, during which she could only, as witnesses reported, scream and groan. The strong, dignified woman who had faced so many challenges throughout her life was reduced to agony by this cruel disease. Her mobility decreased dramatically. She was confined to a wheelchair much of the time and had to be carried up and down stairs. She, who had always been so active, so engaged with the world, now found herself increasingly trapped by her failing body. She wrote to her daughter Sophie, "My dear Friedrichshof is so charming, although it is sad indeed to be wheeled about in a chair like an old lady, and carried up and down stairs like a child. Here, where I have always been so active." Victoria began taking morphine to manage the pain. It helped, but it also left her confused and drowsy at times. Her children came to visit when they could, but she was often too ill to see them for long. The woman who had raised 8 children, who had been at the center of so much political drama, who had written thousands of letters discussing the great events of her age, was now reduced to simply enduring pain. Christmas 1900 was particularly difficult. Victoria was bedridden much of the time now, the cancer causing terrible pain that even morphine couldn't fully control. But her thoughts were not only on her own suffering. Her elderly mother, Queen Victoria, was also gravely ill at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. On Christmas Day, Victoria wrote to her mother, "I wish with all my heart that all my suffering and discomfort would do for us both, and that you might be spared everything that is disagreeable." On the 6th of January, 1901, Queen Victoria wrote one final letter to her eldest daughter, ending with the words, "God bless you, darling child." 16 days later, on the 22nd of January, 1901, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House, surrounded by her family. She was 81 years old and had reigned for nearly 64 years. Victoria was too ill to travel to England for her mother's funeral. She was essentially bedridden now, in too much pain to make the journey. The death of her mother was devastating for Victoria. Despite the complications in their relationship, Queen Victoria's sometimes critical letters, her excessive mourning for Prince Albert, her difficulty understanding some of Victoria's challenges in Prussia, there had been deep love between them. They had written to each other weekly for over 40 years, sharing joys and sorrows, discussing politics and family matters, maintaining a connection across the miles that separated them. Now that connection was severed. Victoria had lost both her parents, Prince Albert in 1861, Queen Victoria in 1901. She had lost her husband Fritz in 1888. She had lost 2 of her children in infancy, and she was now facing her own death, knowing that she had only months, perhaps only weeks, left to live. The spring of 1901 brought no relief, only increasing pain and deterioration, and Victoria wrote to her daughter Sophie, "The attacks of pain so violent, the struggle for breath so dreadful when in bed or lying down, most distressing. The cancer was now wreaking havoc throughout her body, and there was nothing the physicians could do except provide morphine and try to keep her comfortable." The sentries posted outside Friedrichshof found their duty almost unbearable. They could hear Victoria's screams of pain when the spasms hit, and some begged to be moved further away so they would not have to listen to the suffering of the woman who had once been Empress of Germany. Victoria's body was wasting away, but her mind remained sharp. She knew she was dying, and she wanted to ensure that certain matters were settled before the end. She drew up her will carefully, leaving Friedrichshof to her youngest daughter Margaret, who had been such a comfort to her in these final years. She also made arrangements for her extensive correspondence. Thousands of letters exchanged with her parents, her husband, her children, and countless others. Victoria was particularly concerned about these letters. They contained frank discussions of German politics, criticisms of Wilhelm II and his policies, expressions of her fears about Germany's future under her son's leadership. She did not want these papers to fall into Wilhelm's hands, knowing he would either destroy them or use them to further tarnish her reputation. Earlier, in February 1901, Victoria's brother, now King Edward VII, had sent his private secretary, Frederick Ponsonby, to visit his dying sister. Ponsonby was also Victoria's godson, and which made the visit less suspicious to German authorities. But his real mission was to smuggle Victoria's most important papers out of Germany and bring them safely to England. The operation succeeded. Victoria's papers were secretly removed from Friedrichshof and transported to England, where they would eventually be edited by Ponsonby and published in 1928 as Letters of the Empress Frederick. These letters provide an invaluable historical record of the Prussian and German courts from 1858 to 1900, offering insights into the politics, personalities, and challenges of that transformative era. As summer approached, Victoria grew weaker. She was now in almost constant pain, sleeping only fitfully with the help of morphine. Her daughters took turns sitting with her, trying to provide whatever comfort they could. Wilhelm II visited occasionally, but these visits were brief and formal. Even now, at his mother's deathbed, there was little warmth or reconciliation between them. On the 5th of August, 1901, less than 7 months after her mother's death, Victoria died at Friedrichshof. She was 60 years old. Her long struggle with cancer was finally over, and so was a life that had been filled with such promise, and yet so much disappointment. True to form, Wilhelm II's first action after his mother's death was to have soldiers search her rooms for any remaining private papers. He was still concerned that there might be documents that reflected badly on him or on his grandfather Wilhelm I's regime. But once again, Victoria had outmaneuvered him. All the important papers had already been sent to England. Victoria was buried on the 13th of August, 1901, in the Royal Mausoleum of the Friedenskirche at Potsdam, next to her beloved husband Fritz. The mausoleum also contains the remains of her 2 sons, who died in childhood. Little Sigismund, who died of meningitis at 21 months, and Prince Waldemar, who died of diphtheria at 11 years. The tomb features a recumbent marble effigy of Victoria lying at rest, finally at peace after a life of struggle. The funeral was a grand state occasion, with representatives from royal families across Europe in attendance, but it was also, in some ways, a sad reflection of Victoria's complicated legacy. She had been Crown Princess and then Empress of Germany, mother of the Kaiser, daughter of Queen Victoria, yet she died largely isolated, her political dreams unfulfilled, estranged from her eldest son, remembered by many in Germany as the English princess who never quite became properly Prussian. Victoria, Princess Royal, and Empress Frederick lived one of the most fascinating and tragic lives of the 19th century. Born in 1840 as the eldest child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, she was raised to be a force for liberal reform in Europe. Her parents, particularly her father, educated her far beyond what was typical for women of her era, instilling in her progressive political values and a belief that she could make a real difference in the world. Her marriage to Prince Friedrich of Prussia in 1858 was meant to create a bridge between Britain and Prussia, to bring liberal constitutional ideas to the German court, and eventually to transform Germany into a more progressive nation. It was a romantic marriage based on genuine love and shared values, but it was also a political project, one of the great what-ifs of European history. For 30 years, Victoria and Fritz waited to implement their reforms, hoping that when Fritz finally inherited the throne, they could reshape Germany. But fate was cruel. When Fritz finally became Kaiser Friedrich III in 1888, he was already dying of throat cancer. His reign lasted just 99 days, long enough only to show the tantalizing possibility of what might have been, but far too short to achieve any meaningful change. Victoria's tragedy was compounded by her relationship with her eldest son, Wilhelm II. The difficult circumstances of his birth, resulting in permanent injury to his arm, created complications in their relationship from the start. As Wilhelm grew, he rejected his parents' liberal values, embraced Prussian militarism and autocracy, and became increasingly hostile to his mother. When he became Kaiser, he deliberately marginalized her, and their relationship remained cold and distant until her death. The irony is profound. Victoria spent her life trying to influence German politics toward liberalism and constitutional government, but her own son would become one of the most autocratic rulers in German history. Wilhelm II's aggressive foreign policy, his naval arms race with Britain, his support for Austria-Hungary in the July crisis of 1914, all would contribute to the outbreak of World War I, just 13 years after Victoria's death. The catastrophe that Victoria had feared and warned about in her letters would come to pass, with her son playing a central role. Victoria's letters, over 3,700 from Queen Victoria to her, and more than 4,000 from Victoria to her mother, provide an extraordinary historical record. They offer intimate insights into Victorian-era royal life, the politics of 19th century Europe, the challenges of being a woman with political ambitions in a patriarchal society, and the personal costs of being caught between two cultures. These letters reveal Victoria as a complex, often contradictory figure. She could be warm and loving toward her children, yet also critical and demanding. She was genuinely devoted to liberal principles, yet lived within aristocratic structures that were fundamentally hierarchical and exclusive. She criticized German militarism and autocracy, yet she was also proud when Prussia won military victories, as she loved her homeland England. Yet she also came to genuinely care about Germany and wanted the best for her adopted country. Victoria's life also illustrates the limited power that even royal women had in the 19th century. Despite her intelligence, education, and position, she was unable to significantly influence German politics. As Crown Princess, and then briefly as Empress, she was expected to support her husband and defer to the men who held real power. First, her father-in-law, Kaiser Wilhelm I, and Chancellor Bismarck, and later her son Kaiser Wilhelm II. Her attempts to exert influence were seen as inappropriate meddling, and her British background was used to dismiss her views as foreign interference. Yet Victoria never stopped trying. Even in her final years at Friedrichshof, politically marginalized and often in poor health, she continued to write about politics, to discuss European affairs, to maintain her intellectual engagement with the world. She never abandoned her liberal principles, even when it would have been easier to simply accept the conservative militaristic direction Germany was taking. In the decades after her death, Victoria's reputation in Germany suffered. During World War I, anything English was viewed with suspicion, and Victoria's British birth and continued loyalty to her homeland made her an easy target for nationalist criticism. Some German historians portrayed her as a misguided English meddler who had tried to undermine Prussian greatness. Her son Wilhelm II, in exile after Germany's defeat in 1918, wrote little about his mother and seemed uncomfortable discussing their difficult relationship. But more recent historical scholarship has been kinder to Victoria's memory. Historians now recognize her as a woman of genuine intelligence and principle who faced impossible challenges. She was trying to bridge two very different political cultures, British constitutional liberalism and Prussian military autocracy, at a time when those two systems were fundamentally incompatible. She was trying to be both a good daughter to the British royal family and a loyal member of the Prussian royal family, even as those two families represented opposing political philosophies. Some historians have even speculated about what might have been if Fritz had lived longer, if he had been able to reign for 20 or 30 years instead of just 99 days. Could Victoria and Fritz have successfully reformed the German Empire? Could they have made it more constitutional, more liberal, more integrated into the Western European tradition of parliamentary government? And if they had succeeded, might World War I have been avoided, or at least fought very differently? These are unanswerable questions, of course. We cannot know what might have happened in an alternate timeline where Friedrich III lived, but the questions themselves suggest something important about Victoria's life. She represented a path not taken, a possibility for German development that was foreclosed by illness, by Bismarck's political maneuvering, by the rise of militant nationalism, and ultimately by her son's embrace of autocracy. Victoria, Princess Royal and Empress Frederick died believing herself a failure. She had not achieved the political reforms she had worked toward her entire adult life. She was estranged from her eldest son, who rejected everything she valued. She died in isolation, in terrible pain, having watched both her beloved parents and her cherished husband die before her. It would have been hard for her to see, in those final months at Friedrichshof, that her life had any larger meaning or positive legacy. But history has been kinder to her memory than her own time was. We can now see her as a woman of principle, who tried to make the world better, who held fast to humane liberal values in the face of growing militarism and nationalism, who genuinely cared about the welfare of ordinary people even though she lived in palaces. We can appreciate her intelligence, her determination, her loyalty to the ideals her father, Prince Albert, had taught her, and we can mourn the tragedy of a life filled with such promise that ended with such disappointment. Victoria's tomb at Friedrichshof bears a simple inscription, marking her as wife of Kaiser Friedrich III, daughter of Queen Victoria. But perhaps the truest monument to her life is found in her thousands of letters, preserving the thoughts, hopes, fears, and dreams of a remarkable woman who lived through one of history's most transformative eras, and who never stopped believing that people of intelligence and goodwill could make the world better, even when all the evidence suggested otherwise. And so we close the story of Victoria, Princess Royal, the golden child of Britain's golden age, the liberal princess who married into Prussian conservatism, the crown princess who waited 3 decades for power and held it for 3 months, the empress who lived to see her son become the antithesis of everything she believed in, and the mother, daughter, wife, and woman who faced each disappointment with dignity and continued hoping, against all reason, that somehow things might still turn out for the best. Thank you, dear sleeper, for joining us on this peaceful journey through the extraordinary life of Victoria, Princess Royal, and Empress Frederick. May her story of intelligence and dedication, of love and loss, of hope held in the face of disappointment, carry you gently into restful dreams. If you enjoyed this soothing tale of history, please take a moment to like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments about what aspect of Victoria's life touched you most, and subscribe to keep these calming historical stories coming your way. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and may tomorrow bring you joy. Good night from all of us at Sleepy Crown.